Hello and welcome to our video on topic 4. We're going to be talking about political institutions in Mexico tonight. Alright, so first off, Mexico is a federal republic. It is similar to Nigeria and Russia and China that has a very strong central government. It is founded on the idea of a federal system, and it does actually work, again, unlike Nigeria and Mexico. The 1917 Constitution created a three-branch government with checks and balances and protections for civil liberties. And again, it kind of gives Mexico an advantage because on paper it has had robust democratic institutions in place for a very long time. Traditionally, it has followed or used a state corporatist structure under the PRI, power of the PRI or the rule of the PRI. Today it leans more towards a pluralist system like our own. So you could kind of classify Mexico as a neo-corporatist system, similar to Great Britain. Mexico is considered to be a developing country and also a transitional democracy. All right, let's talk about linkage institutions first. Mexico does have political parties, interest groups, and media, and all of those entities have helped move Mexico towards a more legitimate form of democracy. Civil society in Mexico has grown and developed as the PRI has lost influence and power after that 70-year reign. And again, Mexico has the advantage of that long-running constitution, at least on paper, that the institutions were already created. Political parties in Mexico, there are three major political parties, and it is a multi-party system. We'll look at the PRI first. This is the long-running party of power. It was originally founded by a coalition of elites who agreed to pass and share favors and power amongst themselves. It relied on a corporatist structure of bringing in those interest groups to negotiate with inside the government. It also had a heavy focus or emphasis on a patron-client network or system. So the idea of patronage, the idea of receiving gifts and jobs in exchange for support was one of the main reasons why the PRI was able to stay into power for so long. The PRI would lose power between 2000 and 2012, which is kind of the birth of this new Mexican democracy, because they did have a transfer of power. They have regained the presidency with the most recent elections in 2012. All right, the second party we'll look at here is the PAN party. The PAN party would be considered the center-right or right party in comparison to the PRI, which is your centrist party in Mexico. Not much impact for the PAN until we get to the 1990s, where they began to win a few governor's races in Mexico. They are a business-oriented party. They're definitely more open to religion, more of a role of religion in society. They're open to that with the PAN party. They're very strong in northern Mexico, and some of their elements of their platform, regional autonomy, so more power to local government, less government involvement in the economy, a more liberal open market system. Again, the endorsement of clean and fair elections as one of the parties that has wrestled or fought for relevance with the PRI. And then finally, support for private education outside of state education, also religious education. And again, this is the party to the right of the PRI. The PRD, this is the party that exists to the left of the PRI. They've had a lot of problems in terms of organizing themselves, a lot of internal arguments over issues on how to treat the economy and dealing with poverty. So there's been kind of an overall lack of focus, which has really limited their success. Again, they have run some pretty popular candidates, particularly in 2006 with Obrador, who almost won the presidency, but they just haven't gotten over the hump to win that big national election. They do hold seats in the national legislature like the other two parties. Elections in Mexico, we're talking about direct election for the president. They don't do a runoff, so it's a plurality election. They have elections for the Chamber of Deputies, which is just like our House, and also their Senate. So very similar to the United States in terms of who is directly elected. The PRI's kind of focus of votes will come from small towns and rural areas, the less educated, the older, and the poor. The PAN, focused in the north, middle-class professionals and businessmen, urban, the better educated, and those who are more devout in terms of religion. And then finally, the PRD caters to your younger, more politically active Mexicans from the central region. That's a big base of support in and around Mexico City. Some education, some small towns and urban. So the PRD kind of does encompass more areas and crosses over into more areas than the other two parties. All right, if we look at the most recent elections in Mexico, we'll look at 2000, 2006, and 2012, the most recent presidential elections. In 2000, it's significant because Vicente Fox wins. He's the first candidate who was not a PRI member to win the presidency over that course of the 7-year reign. He comes in with a lot of fanfare, a lot of support, a lot of goodwill, but really isn't able to fully actualize a lot of those visions or dreams, mainly because of the divided government that ends up being created in the Mexican Congress. In 2006, the second PAN president will win election, Calderon. He wins by a narrow margin, and this election is viewed by some as illegitimate and flawed. Okay, it was contested by Obrador. All right, he was not happy with the result. There was a great deal of protest, and basically he would rule for the next 6 years with some issues of whether or not he should be in power. In 2012, Nieto, who is a PRI member, will win the presidency. And this third election in this 12-year period is going to prove that the Mexican system has developed, and we have had peaceful transfers of power with the long-running party actually re-winning the presidency. As mentioned before, the president is a first-past-the-post position, and they do use plurality. They don't have a runoff. For example, Peña Nieto won the presidency with right around a third of the actual vote. The media, very little power under PRI rule. Media was government-run and managed. It was part of the patron-client system of rewards. It became more independent beginning in the 1980s. Some of that was due to the fact of the opening of satellite television that was brought into Mexico. The press today, much more open. There is a great deal of investigative and independent reporting in Mexico. There are certain entities that do own some of your larger media outlets and have connections to political parties like the PRI, but there is freedom of press. Now, there has been some issues with the influence of the cartels on investigative reporting, on what reporters are willing to report for fear of their lives. So that is one limit on the media, but it is open in Mexico. The president, 6-year terms, a sexenio, one time. That's special to Mexico. The PRI controlled this position all the way up until the year 2000. And this was selection, not really election. The elections that took place were flawed and fraudulent over that period of time. Presidents are powerful in terms of the system and the Constitution in Mexico. They have the power to appoint, power in terms of being in charge of foreign policy. They can initiate legislation. They can issue decrees, much like the Russian president. They can also create government agencies when they are needed or necessary. Here's something to put the presidential power into focus. Between 1929 and 1992, every single piece of presidential legislation that was approved by the president, that was approved by a rubber stamp Congress. So the Mexican Congress has kind of come into its own and become an actual check in one of the branches. Previously, it was nothing more than a rubber stamp for the president and the PRI. The legislature is bicameral. They have a Senate and a Chamber of Deputies. They have a mixed election system, so it's kind of like the way the Duma was before Putin's reforms. It's split. 96 senators are selected or elected by single-member districts in plurality, and 32 are selected by proportion. 300 members of the Chamber of Deputies are elected, first-past-the-post, single-member districts. 200 are done proportionally. So they split. It's a mixed system. Half single-member district, first-past-the-post, and half proportional. The Congress really didn't have much power under the PRI, much more beginning in 1997 and then through 2000. Much more important today, and many people believe it's created kind of a gridlock that has limited some of the policy progress, okay, beginning in 2000. There are laws in place that have been put in place by the Mexican legislature that ensure that at least 30% of the legislature is female, and that's very progressive. When you look at that, that's much higher than the United States, much higher than Great Britain, the other advanced democracy that we study. All right, elections, very fraudulent under the rule of the PRI. It was one of the ways the PRI maintained its power. Again, if you look at an election that stands out as being really corrupt or fraudulent, it would be, we look at Nigeria, we think about 2007. In 1988, that's the election that was viewed as a total disaster in Mexico. After that 88 election, there was a push for reform, and again, the PRI was trying to change its position, trying to make itself more legitimate by reforming the election system because there was so much internal and external criticism. They created the IEF to kind of regulate, and it's done a much better job, particularly in the most recent elections. They've had free and fair elections with some dispute since 2000 in Mexico, and voter turnout is very similar to the United States, hovering there right around 50%. Depending on the election, much less for congressional elections, a little more for presidential. The judiciary is very similar to the U.S. system. We're going to talk a little bit about some reform that has taken place in their system in the last decade or so in class. It's still not totally independent. There's a real focus on code law, not on common law, but on code law, written law. The system on paper does have the power of judicial review, but this is not developed, as we've noticed in most of the countries we study. And the civil liberties are actually laid out and well protected by the Constitution. The bureaucracy is very large. Again, strong central government, large bureaucracy. Mexico City has a very high concentration of government workers, and it has been patronage driven. It's been a reward system or a avenue of rewards through the years, and it continues even today. The bureaucracy also contains a very large parastatal sector, Pemex being the largest. We talked about parastatals. We have them in Nigeria. We have them in Mexico. They're more common in your developing countries. You know, the Banyads kind of fill that role in Iran. There are state-owned industries in China, state-owned industries in Russia. So again, Mexico maintains these parastatals to run or provide services that in a lot of countries are done by private companies, like here in the United States. We're talking about things like water and electricity, transportation, communication. The bureaucracy does create large portions of jobs for the middle class and upper classes. So this is one way to advance in Mexican society. And one of the other great things about these government jobs is they have wonderful security, job security. The military in Mexico really does not have a real political tradition and is not very active. It has been used to quell domestic disputes, student protests in the late 1960s, the Chiapas rebellion with the Zapatistas. So there has been a use of the military domestically, but they don't really have any policy influence like we see in Nigeria and to a lesser extent Iran. All right. They have been used in the war on the cartels that was initiated by Calderon. And there is a certain amount of corruption, just like we see corruption in the Mexican police. There is a certain amount of corruption also in the Mexican military. Local governments, again, the perspective of the federal system in Mexico. They do have 31 states. They do have a federal district established around Mexico City. A lot of these local government jobs are also part of the camarilla or the patronage system in Mexico. Again, this was one of the foundation elements of the PRA maintaining its power and control over its 70 years, and it continues today. Thank you for joining me for this video on political institutions in Mexico. Make sure that you do the Google form.